Okay, we're on to our next novel, which is Tracks by Louise Erdrich. I want to hear from you a bit about the answers to the quiz questions that I just gave you, but let me point out to you, you will have read the back of your paperback, at least the back of mine, tells you that this is part of a trilogy. Louise Erdrich is alive and well and producing novels like crazy up till today. This is one of three. Love Medicine and Beat Queen are the other two in this trilogy. I confess that I haven't read them. I hear they're fabulous, and they're coming up close to the top of my list. Have you, Catherine, read them?
Yes, I read Love Medicine for another class.
Oh, good. And how did you like it?
It's pretty good. I like it. It talks more about the family, about the pillager, the cash cow, the war scenes, and how everyone's connected.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so it builds out this community, sort of Faulkner style, like his Yaknapatawpha County. This is a North Dakota territory that's filled with people. Thank you. And tell me which you preferred, that one or this one. Can you say, since I haven't read The Beat Queen?
I don't know. I like both of them.
Yeah.
I like both of them because it's part of a trilogy.
Yeah.
I like both of them.
And is the other one as magical as this? There's so much indigenous spirituality, let's say. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Because they're based around, the Indians and things like that. So they're all basically
Yeah. And what class did you read it for?
Professor Hogue, Contemporary American Fiction.
Yeah, Hogue's Contemporary American Fiction. That's Professor Hogue's very interesting and good, I think. So, good. Anybody else read any Louise Erdrich? I lately undertook to listen books on tape. Does anybody do that when you're driving? Oh, it's such a pleasure. Different way of experiencing a novel. I bought the tapes of, I think, her most recent book, or maybe her second to last. And I was going to look up the title to make sure I could tell you, but it's something about the Singers Club. Does anybody know the Butchers Singing Club? And it's about a North Dakota butcher who emigrates from Germany to the northern United States because he has enough money to get him on the train after World War I as far as North Dakota, and he stops and he becomes a butcher. So it's not, she's left the indigenous territory and starting to look at the European immigrant territory, but a great chronicler of American historical reality. So I hope you like this book. I think it's kind of stunning myself. I mean, it's so well written, I think. I'm going to give you some of the historical background, but instead of just starting to natter on, I want to ask you how you answered the questions on the quiz. Anybody want to volunteer to tell us about the narrative structure of this novel? Who has a handle on it? Yeah, Kim, start out. Will you start by telling us to turn to our table of contents, will you? That'll give us a nice little help. It gives us a help, except not as complete, because doesn't each one of our chapters have the name of a person? Tell us about that, will you?
So it each chapter alternates between Nana Push and Pauline being the narrator. And so the first chapter starts with Nana Push, who's the grandfather of Lulu, he's directing his narration to.
He's addressing his narration to?
His granddaughter, Lulu.
Right. And do we know that? When do we find out whom he's talking to?
Well, the first page he addresses granddaughter, and then a few chapters later you learn out exactly who she is.
Yeah, just let me interrupt you and point out that you don't find out too much about this granddaughter. Indeed, she gets lost because he immediately flashes back to that terrible winter of the problems that we hear about in chapter 1. But if you go to page 31, and I hope our pagination is the same, do you have that typographical break at the top that says Power Travels in Bloodlines? Except that's not the page I wanted you to go to. Hang on. Well, that tells us that she bore the child. We learn that this is Fleur's daughter, the granddaughter. And then it's 33, where we're back in Nana Push's. I mean, Pauline mentions that Fleur has a daughter, and then we're back in Nana Push's chapter 3 narrative, and it's on the page 33, second paragraph from the bottom of the page. Not Fleur, though, getting back to her. Your mother both clung to me and resisted me like any daughter like you're doing now. So it takes us a little while to know whom Nana Push is addressing. There is, okay, so Kim, that's the first half. Tell us about Pauline. Who is she talking to? Who is she and who is she talking to? Or is she writing rather than talking? Do we know?
I wasn't really for sure. I mean, I don't think she's addressing the granddaughter necessarily, like Nana Push, and I don't know. I haven't picked up yet exactly who she's
talking to. She does say you. We're going to look at it carefully. Kathy, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it was hard to know who she was talking to, but I kind of thought like she was talking to the reader because we're all she has. You know?
Yeah.
She's such a lonely character.
Yeah, I think Nana Push and Pauline are to represent opposite ends of the spectrum, are they not? Pauline integrates into mainstream culture. She's a very spiritual person, but in ways that are all. I mean, she becomes Catholic. She becomes rather fanatical in certain ways. We'll trace that audience question, but I also think, like Kathy, that she is addressing the reader in almost a written form. She's telling her story, but to an anonymous. She's no longer part of the tribal oral tradition. So I think there's a kind of privileging here of orality, and there's a real discussion of who keeps the historical documents and whether they have to be written or not, because what's getting lost is the history of this indigenous group. So that issue of oral or written is going to be interesting to us as we follow the narrative structure. Thank you, Kim. Do you want to add to that? Yeah, Chris.
It's kind of interesting. Thinking about the receipt, and the lack of receipt led them to losing the land. Yeah. And then losing their history as a result of not having it written, things like that.
That's right.
And then also thinking about Pauline.
Yeah.
And who she's addressing. In that they seem like polar opposites, Nana Push and Pauline. Yeah. And that Nana Push speaks for Fleur, because Fleur is not present. Yeah. And then Pauline, Fleur would be the historical indigenous American. Yeah. And then Pauline would represent the complete miscegenation, or not miscegenation, transculturalization. Yeah. The complete surrender of Indian values into white culture. Yeah. So then Nana Push would be speaking to the daughter of the Indian culture, whereas Pauline would be speaking to the reader, who probably in America, written in English, is Anglo-Saxon white.
Yeah. Yeah, that I think is basically the structure that's set up. There are moments, though, when we see Pauline reverting to an indigenous position, and I want to look at some of those, because those are those moments when the syncretic aspects of this narrative come absolutely to the fore, when we see Pauline seeming to participate in one cultural context, especially when she's learning to be an undertaker, remember, and she flies up and sees things. We'll look at the passage in a minute. But basically, Chris and Kim, there's a real alternation. One is a communal voice, one is much more individualized. And then the question is there a difference in style between these two narrators? Kim, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I was just going to go, because Pauline, she was like an outcast from the beginning, so that definitely goes to the opposite of Nana Push and the importance of community in that culture, and she totally rejects. Even at first, she thinks she's half-blooded, and then she's like, no, you're all white, and so she totally rejects all that, and just even in the nunnery, she's completely secluded there by her fanaticism. So in a way, she's kind of, let's say, a transcultural victim. She ends up no place, in betwixt, and yet having chosen the Catholic Church with a vengeance. So, but in terms of the verbal surface, do we see differences between Nana Push's way of talking and Pauline's way of writing? Yeah, Ruth?
I thought it was interesting. It seemed like Pauline was constantly trying to prove herself, sell her case, defend what she did, where Nana Push was just like, this is the way it is. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, Stephen, push the button, please.
There's also a somewhat comical element in Nana Push when he's telling the story, because he brings a lot of humor into the way he describes things to Lulu, whereas Pauline, it's very dogmatic in the way that she's telling whoever about this story.
I wish you could point to one of those humorous passages. Could you easily?
I don't remember what page it's on, but
you remember?
I felt that the exchanges between Nana Push and Margaret.
Yeah.
Those were always, I thought, really. It was funny because they're.
Yeah, you're right.
Their, I guess their verbiage, to each other was always, very, very quick-witted,
Yeah, that's
especially
right.
Margaret. So.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. That's a good example. What I was Norma, please.
There's one where the priest asks Nana Push something, and he tells him, "Oh well, we're already sleeping together." So I thought that was funny.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He's a fabulous voice. I mean, a very wise voice. The thing that strikes me about his narration is how metaphorically charged it is. At one point I started, and especially similes, something is like something else. He describes so much. And that's the basis of poetry, isn't it? Describing one thing in terms of another. My love is like a red, red rose, or the leaves dance on the trees. Somehow leaves don't dance, they just do this. But we personalize, we personify them. I mean, just the very first sentence of the novel, which is fabulously beautiful, I think. We started dying before the snow, and like the snow, we continued to fall. Absolutely, we're like snow falling. It's a chilling, literally and figuratively, metaphor, isn't it? And if you go through and you circle the likes, just go to page 2, about 7 or 8 lines down. Our tribe unraveled. Do you see it? 10 lines. Our tribe unraveled like a coarse rope, frayed at either end as the old and new among us were taken. Again, you can sit and think about it. It really is poetry. That's a poetic line. You can think about that, frayed on either end as the new old and the new among us were taken. And furthermore, it takes us always, his images always take us back to nature. Or in this case, a coarse rope, which isn't snow, but it's nonetheless a sense of the earthy, the primal. It's beautifully written to give the modern Western reader a sense of a kind of mythic, indigenous something. Maybe we can say, it just conforms to all our stereotypes of the indigenous peoples in touch with nature and so forth. But really, Nana Push is, it seems. Yeah, Megan.
I think that her as well, the author, being part of that blood.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that she captures the essence of the way the Indian dialogue is of being so one with nature that you are part of that nature. And then Pauline's dialogue where she's not.
No, she's not.
She's very white.
She wants to leave, and she does leave, and she goes to seek her fortune, as it were, outside of the group. That's right. I think, and I have to look up more, maybe some of you have, I think Erdrich is part Ojibwe. Yeah, thank you for confirming that. I didn't remind myself this morning of that. North Dakotan, of course, but I don't know if your book has some of you will have this edition, but there's one blurb on the back of this by, it quotes the New York Times, and I think it's a very interesting comment, since Megan, you've raised the issue of it takes one to know one. I mean, basically, this is a person who's in tune with indigenous and especially Northern Plains indigenous groups, because she herself is partly indigenous Plains. I like this comment. Miss Erdrich's novels, regional in the best sense, are, and then it says about, and quotes about roundabout, are about the experience of Native Americans in the same way that Toni Morrison's are about black people, William Faulkner's and Eudora Welty's about the South, Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud's about the Jews. The specificity implies nothing provincial or small. Miss Erdrich artfully sifts the miraculous through the mundane. Now, well, of course, that's grist for our magical realist mill, isn't it? The miraculous through the mundane. But what I like about that statement is that we can either pigeonhole indigenous African American Jewish Southern writers and call them regional as a term of depreciation, which I don't think any of us would really do. These are all fabulous writers. But his point is you take the local and it becomes human, universal, in ways that I think work for this novel. Let's see. Any other comments? Yeah, Steve. Sorry, Chris.
It's okay.
Almost Steve.
It happens all the time.
Yeah. It's Chris Stevens.
Yeah, it's a plural.
Yes, right.
The truth of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, tell me.
The interesting thing about Faulkner and comparing it to Eldritch is interesting because you have, like, always in Faulkner you have your central community, and then you have your central characters usually outside the community. And then it's the same thing here.
And who comes into the community and upsets the structure in one, like Joe Christmas in Light in August and so forth, yeah.
And then same thing here, but then it becomes interesting because your actual community base of this writer, the Indians, the actual culture of that community is moved to the outside. Mm-hmm. And so then you have the outsider, Pauline, who's actually becoming part of the mainstream. And you have Fleur, who's part of the Indian community, also an outsider from that community even. So you have all these different gradients of leaving community.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. I mean, Fleur does kind of disappear in the end, doesn't she? We're not quite sure, are we? It doesn't, yeah, she just... what you're saying makes me think of Macondo and that artificial enclosure, which is Macondo, but in some sense Latin America. And then the inside and outside and what that means. That's a good point, yeah. Other comments about, well, I want to look some more at the verbal surface, the language of this book, because I think it's so well done. But just turn, if you will, since the second question I asked you was about the end, turn to the end of the novel and this idea of privileging written, the West privileges written histories, that is, histories that are documented on paper. Oral narratives come and go. And here we get this irony at the end. We know, and I'm going to tell you a little more history, we know about the loss of indigenous lands at this point. You notice that this is in the teens, starting 1912, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll tell you why she chooses these particular dates, 1912 through 1924. Look at the very end. There's a kind of bittersweet triumph, is there not? Nanapush gets back his granddaughter from from her, talking about insider and outsider and immigration and emigration. She's had to leave the girl. He's got her back. Let's just look at the last couple of pages. But it's it's 225, the first paragraph of that last section, that's so ironic. Because what does he say? He says, we didn't have documents to support our ownership when a system, the Western system, required documents of ownership, a whole different system, and now we're being documented to death. That's what he says. Look at it. After we knew Fleur was gone and there was no telling when and if she would ever return, Margaret and I went after the authorities, put our minds to getting you back home. That you, of course, Lou, the granddaughter. Nectar chose to go south after he finished 8th grade, even farther away than you, down to the state of Oklahoma. We did not give up. I wrote letters, learned to send them, from Theobald and Hoop Dance, as anything mailed through Bernadette never reached its destination. Margaret and Father Damien begged and threatened the government, but once the bureaucrats sink their barbed pens, a nice metaphor, right? Barbed pens into the lives of Indians, the paper starts flying, a blizzard of legal forms, a waste of ink by the gallon, a correspondence to which there is no end. That's when I began to see that we were becoming what we were becoming, and the years have borne me out. A tribe of file cabinets and triplicates, a tribe of single-space documents, directives, policy, a tribe of pressed trees. What a brilliant line. He still remembers those trees. A tribe of chicken scratch that can be scattered by the wind, diminished to ashes by one struck match. Well, we'll leave it there. You know how it ends. We see the reunion, and it seems like a triumph, but it's very clear that who's going to triumph in the end here. So that issue of who gets to keep the records is I think, throughout this. this book. Let me just say, so okay, ending. Anybody else want to comment on the ending? Did you have perceptions while you were writing your quizzes about how this ends? Is it predictable? Is it, yeah, it's quite predictable. I mean, it is a kind of bittersweet, happy ending, even as we know that this world is not long. I mean, so the tradition petering out. Yeah, Kathy.
I think the ending was predictable because there's a lot of foreshadowing throughout the novel about different things. But each chapter was really, really surprising to me.
Good.
Even though the ending was predictable, each chapter was so surprising and exciting and awesome. And I just didn't want to leave each chapter.
Good. I'm so glad. Yeah, that scene of the storm and locking the fellows in the locker, it's just one of the best written scenes. I want to go through it with you, but there are those kinds of moments throughout the novel. It has a real pace on it, this book, I think, yeah. Other comments? And then number 3, Fleur. Does anybody want to comment on Fleur? I said, I threw off a line, which I shouldn't have when you were writing, saying something about she's the kind of absent center of this novel, sometimes present, but mainly Nana Push and Pauline circulating around this kind of force of nature, this female force. Did you read her that way, or am I making that up? Yeah. Any comments about her at this point that need to be made? Richard, what did you think?
Of Fleur?
Mm-hmm. Push your button, will you? Poor Richard. Richard's great fun to put on the spot. I don't know why. It's because he takes it easily. That's why.
I don't know. On my quiz, I just said that she was pretty much the main magical force in this novel because of the spirit that was conveyed about her, and she drowned 3 times and had the power that men kept dying. And one thing that really stood out to me about her that developed her character a lot was when Margaret showed up at her house after they had shaved her head, and she went over and shaved all her hair off like it was nothing.
Mm-hmm. Remind us of that. Will you tell us about that shaved head scene? Why and who and all of that?
I was just thinking about that, exactly why the Morriseys did that to him, and I can't remember exactly why. Mm-hmm. But Nana Push and Margaret were taken by Napoleon and one of the other ones. The Morriseys all kind of blend together for me. But and Clarence.
Clarence, yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And they like lock them up in a meat locker, or I mean in the barn, and shave their heads, and it's all pretty traumatic. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember. Maybe someone else knows exactly why they did it. I don't really remember.
Yeah, Ruth, can you tell us why? Or can someone?
Ellie and Sophie had sex.
Oh,
because Ellie and Sophie had sex, and they were trying to take revenge by treating Margaret the same way as Ellie had treated Sophie.
I thought they were trying to force them to sign the contract, and scaring them into signing the contract for land. It's both. Yeah, that one set the other.
I think it's both.
Yeah, they used that as like the means to do it, and to scare them.
Yeah, any other comments on that? Yeah, Stephen.
One of the things that stood out the most to me, as long as we're talking about Fleur, is in that particular scene where Nana Push is trying to convince the guys to let him go, and then he says to one of them, I forgot which character was, that if you do this to Margaret, you're basically doing this to Fleur, you know, and you don't want to really upset her. And I think I can remember one of the guys like almost dropping his chin, you know, not realizing that by doing this to Margaret, he was going to have to deal with Fleur, and that's something that he didn't really think about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, she's a very powerful figure. We'll look a little more at that whole hair motif, won't we? For now, let's follow Fleur a little more closely. Look at this is partly, Stephen, what you were saying. Just look at page 12. We already, early on in the novel, have a sense of this woman, as Richard says, as a kind of the locus of, we won't say magic here quite, although there's some of that. I mean, it's true. She drowns 3 times, is resuscitated. She's friends, basically, with the sea monster that seems to haunt people's nightmares. But look at page 12. Right away, we know, just from the very top of the page, after the first time, we thought she'd keep to herself, live quiet, stop killing men off by drowning in the lake. We thought she would keep the good ways, but then after the second return, and after old Nanapush nursed her through the sickness, which we've just read about in chapter 1, right? We knew that we were dealing with something much more serious. Alone out there, she went haywire. This is Pauline talking, right? She went haywire, out of control. She messed with evil, laughed at the old women's advice, and dressed like a man. It's very important here, point of view. She went haywire. This is Pauline. You could say, oh, she maintained her strong stance, if you were Nanapush or others. But she didn't want to go along. And so Pauline says, you know, she's out of control. She got herself into some half-forgotten medicine, studied ways we shouldn't talk about. Some say she kept the finger of a child in her pocket and a powder of unborn rabbits in a leather thong around her neck. She laid the heart of an owl on her tongue so she could see at night, and went out hunting, not even in her own body. We know for sure because the next morning in the snow or dust we followed the tracks of her bare feet and saw where they changed, where the claws sprang out. The pad broadened and pressed into the dirt. By night we heard her chuffing cough, the bear cough. By day her silence and the wide grin she threw to bring down our guard made us frightened, and so forth. Okay, now who is the we and the us here? This is Pauline's chapter. Until, for about the first, this is while we're still, as good readers, trying to find out who's telling us what and why, right? As readers, and whether there's an internal constructed audience within the text, or whether I, the reader, am supposed to be the only audience. But look at the our and the we on page 11 begins. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down, we get this we. We're told it's Pauline. Soon after, we noticed many women changed, grew afraid, wouldn't leave his house, and would not, so forth. So we noticed. And then the paragraph 2 down, our mothers warn us that we'll think he's handsome. And then we get a description of this sea monster who takes women, right? I think, if I may just jump to the conclusion here, or to the punchline, that this is, somehow she represents the women of Argus. It's a kind of communal voice. Pretty soon it's going to turn into I. But Pauline does have, in a sense, a community. She's chatting, gossiping with these women. We think this about Fleur, and we think that. So there is a kind of communal narrative. But look, it's on page 13 where the we shifts to I. And I haven't charted whether we get more we's, but mainly from here on it's I. No, there are we's. I've got one circled on page 29. So Pauline goes in and out of a kind of we others have observed that Fleur went haywire, you know, and so forth. But look at, it's the middle of the page, about 2 lines below the middle of page 13. She didn't go there for a handout, although she got that, but to ask for work. She got that too, or we got her. It's hard to tell which came out worse, her or the men of the town. Or we got her, we, the women of Argus, I think. Look down to the last paragraph of that page, and it's an I. I got to Argus through Dutch, and so forth. So Pauline is a little slippery there. She's both, her chapters are both we and I. Yeah, Anne.
This is the same Pauline who's telling the story much later, after the fact.
Yeah.
This is the same Pauline who's very aware that Fleur was much prettier than she was.
Oh, yeah.
Who the men didn't notice Pauline.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, she loses it by the end. I mean, she's.
Yeah.
I won't be ugly, but but she really. I mean, she's talking about Fleur going haywire, and then what does she do?
Yeah, right. In other words, she's a most unreliable narrator. Yeah, right, yeah. And any first-person narrator is unreliable. Once I taught a course in point of view in the modern fiction, which is all about narrative technique, where you know, we read a lot of good novels, but we pay mainly attention, and I choose novels that have complicated narrative structures like this one. What I want to do someday is just teach only unreliable narrators, because there are famous unreliable narrators, especially Nabokov, but others, of course, that tell us lies but we can't tell because that's the only source of information. But usually authors will start to put in clues about how this person is a little nuts, but you see, what you're saying, Anne, is very important, because we know that Pauline is unreliable, but we don't quite know it here. It takes us, you know, it's almost like on the second reading is when you find out that she has a real axe to grind with respect to Fleur in the ways you're talking about, and with respect to indigenous culture more generally. So, thank you, yeah, for that point, yeah. Ruth?
I was going to mention, I think one of the most interesting things about Fleur that I really like is that in ancient Mayan culture, they had these things called naguales. Are you familiar with them?
Yes, I am. Yeah,
what it was like you were assigned an animal at your birth, and I heard the old way of doing it was going out into the woods, and an animal would approach you, but later it was where they took ashes from the fire and sprinkled them across the like right outside the door, and whatever animal right after the baby was born, and whatever animal went across, they would look at its paws and decide what it was. And I just think it's really interesting. And when your nagual dies, you die with it. And so I thought it was really interesting how Fleur sort of how the lands are being cut down and things like that, and how it would seem that Fleur would die with the lands because of her sort of animalistic form.
And so her nagual is in a way the territory itself.
Right, because she's a bear and she's an owl and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. And this nagual, N-A-G-U-A-L, or sometimes with an H, the G and H get confused, nagual or nagual, is used to this day in traditional ceremonies in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, where there are dances where the dancer puts on a mask, and it'll be a mask of a coyote or a mask of an alligator or some animal, and then as the dance proceeds, the person, in theory, and presumably this is a belief system that continues to operate, the person takes on the characteristics of his nagual. That is, he becomes, the animal recognizes its spirit or its self and enters. So that kind of animism, again, where there's so much of magical realism, and especially this ethnographic kind, all of the boundaries that we consider neat and clean in, mainly we do, in Western culture, the difference between animals and humans, for example, that boundary is blurred, and the nagual is one of the places where that separation between human and other mammals, let's say, or other birds or whatever, gets if not erased, at least blurred. Yeah.
Right. I thought it was really interesting too that it was, it reached from Mexico to North Dakota. It was that whole feeling or nature. So it was really interesting to me that it still existed in sort of the 1900s, that what existed so long ago.
Yeah, and you're reading it here not as a nagual in particular, but just her association that's Pauline is saying suddenly her feet became claws. Right. Notice the use of the word tracks in this paragraph. We're going to read tracks now and again. Tracks is the title of this book, as you will have noticed. There's something about that tracks that it is symbolic. It's those traces that are left. We think of tracks as a hunting kind of thing, for one, and that seems, oh yes, indigenous hunters and gatherers or whatever. But tracks has a real loaded significance in this novel, and it means, I think, besides the specific meanings, there's a kind of sense of what traces, what vestiges. How do we know? How can we track these cultures that have been overcome, largely? Okay, let me just go. You know what I think I'll do? We don't have too much more time. I think I'll just give you a bit of history. If any of you are interested in reading up on the history that is the backdrop for this novel, I can show you a great essay by a woman named Nancy Peterson that I think is very good. In a book called Against Amnesia, where there's a chapter on Erdrich, a chapter on Morrison, a chapter on two more, let's say, minority women writers. You happen to have it right there? Oh, good. Who are the other two? Would you tell me? One's the Canadian Japanese whose name has escaped me.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with
She's supposed to be great.
Toni Morrison, Irina Klefitz.
Oh, yes, who's Jewish American. Joy Kogawa is the person I'm thinking of. I've only read Nancy Peterson's book on the subject, but Joy Kogawa is someone I'd like to teach in this context. So if you're interested in, now you know where the book is, right here. Yeah, I have a copy too. It's called Against Amnesia. And the whole idea is, the reason I thought to mention it is, Nancy Peterson's notion is that these women are writing against amnesia. They're writing in the hope of recreating, recuperating, constructing a usable past, really. So, yeah. Did somebody over there have a... Okay, Against Amnesia, Nancy Peterson. Very good book, I think. And what's interesting is to see the diversity of these women's in ethnic or racial identifications, and yet that they're working on the same kind of project. It's a very big project for women writers, and especially indigenous or African American or Japanese Canadian writers, because their history, our history, has been occluded. So it's not the same project for white American males, though sometimes it is. Can't think of any great examples right offhand. Yeah.
I had something to say about the hair issue in Tracks.
Oh, would you say?
Also,
yes.
in Love Medicine, when Lulu gets older, she loses her hair in a fire, actually, because she was having an affair with Nectar as they got older, who is Eli's brother. And she loses her hair. I don't know the significance of the hair loss. You know, her mom and, you know, everybody with the hair. I don't understand.
Okay,
but Lulu does lose her hair. Like, she gets bald.
Is that who Nana Push is telling her not to marry?
No, he's telling her not to marry Morrissey. Nectar is Ellie's brother.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he's a cash pot.
I don't know which Morrissey. Right?
No.
Actually, Lulu is going to have like 9 boys. And oh, I'm sorry.
I wanted to hear. In Love Medicine, she's going to do what you just said. We won't.
Right. I mean, she'll lose her hair, but I mean, she has a lot of affairs and a lot of kids by fathers that are not there and things like that.
Thank you, Catherine. We're going to investigate this matter, but one might almost guess. I won't guess, so we'll look into that. I will. Would you all too? About the hair theme? I hadn't noticed it until you both raised it. Yeah, interesting. I hadn't noticed it. I took it to be a form of humiliation in the scene you were talking about.
Well, in that scene, but there's other scenes where, like, Nana Push is talking about how pulling out their hair in stressful issues, like some men would have pulled out two handfuls of hair by now when he's talking to Eli. And he's like, but you're too vain, you would never do that.
Yeah, Kathy.
He makes one comment about, I'm going to tell you how the women of this tribe came to be bald or something. But then it's just Fleur and Margaret. So I guess maybe there's some sort of overlap there with the books and all, but we only see 2 of it.
There's no doubt a series of beliefs surrounding I'm thinking of the cliche of scalping. I'm sorry, I can't help but think of it. It is to disempower, is to take one's hair. I don't know. Anyway, Anne, did you have something?
Well, you were saying it was meant to humiliate her, and it was, but by Fleur cutting her own hair, she turned it around into a gesture of defiance and strength.
Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the initial gesture against Margaret was that, and then there was a kind of, it's like conquest and counter-conquest. You take the language of the conquerors and turn it against themselves in a subversive fashion.
And, solidarity also, like when the spouse of a cancer patient will shave their heads.
Oh my gosh, I've not heard of that. I see. Thank you. Okay, let me just say a couple of things if nobody else wants to say things here about this history. Let me just give you a few dates, and this comes from Nancy Peterson's book and an article also that she wrote on this topic. This is a history of dispossession, right? Why start at 1912? Well, we go back before 1912, but there's the first date and law that Nancy Peterson gives us, and I think she's quite authoritative, is the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. Dawes, D-A-W-E-S. This Allotment Act, of course, passed by the U.S. government, makes it easy, or made it easy, to divide up land that was formerly held communally on reservations. They could allot it to individual Indians. So this was a way of converting tribes from a hunting and gathering organization to a capitalistic, individualistic agricultural economy. Suddenly, parcels of land are allotted to individuals. Well, golly, that's an interesting idea. They become trust patents. Those are what these are called, these deeds to what had been formerly communal land. Individuals are given trust patents under this Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. Then comes along 1906, the Burke Act, B-U-R-K-E Act. Now the land was given for 25 years. That was the Dawes Act, 1887. But in 1906, it turns out the 25 years could be shortened, so that individuals holding those lands could sell them or lease them. They were being taxed, so they could lose their land as well. So you see what's going on here. Instead of a communally held block, you have individual allotments that are now private property, and therefore prey to all of the dangers and I suppose the benefits of private property. What happened is that lots of the indigenous allotment holders could not pay the taxes sold to white people. So there's a progressive loss of land owned or held by indigenous peoples. By 1917, Indians with more than one-half white blood got these fee patents, that were given allotments that were taxable, so that it began to be a racial issue as well as a legal one. Who gets what? Long story short, you can look into this more, but those are dates that are essential, 1887 and 1906 and 1917. This idea that a half-blood person has greater rights to the land. They're called fee patents. There's a difference between a trust patent and a fee patent. Before the allotment program, before 1887, 139 million acres of land was held in trust, that is, was held communally. By 1934, skipping way ahead, there are only 48 million. So 139 million to 48 million acres of land. The ostensible aim of the legislation was to maintain Indian ownership, but the laws had the opposite effect. Indigenous peoples couldn't pay the taxes, weren't used to an agricultural economy. They had been hunters and gatherers in the northern plains. So you could say that the economy is a theme of this novel and this history of dispossession as well. Remember, the characters throughout the novel work to raise money to pay their taxes. Page 182, there's a reference to government Indians. We might want to look at it real quick. Page 182, oh, sorry, I don't have it marked. Let's not. The government Indians would be those people who are constantly owned by the government because of the need to pay taxes on the land that was, of course, originally theirs, held in trust, that is, held as a communal matter. So So the government Indians would be those working against the cause of the common good. And we see that kind of dynamic in the community as a whole in these incidents we've been talking about. So let me just finish looking at my notes here. The history of allotment haunts Erdrich's characters, as opposed to the novel we'll read next time, our next novel, which is Leslie Silko's novel entitled Ceremony, which is about the Laguna Pueblo Indians, where in fact that group occupies lands that were historically held by the tribe. So the northern part of the country is allotted, and therefore the Indians dispossessed. Okay, I think that's enough. I write down Nanapush and Lulu as a history. Oh, yeah, the issue of history writing versus history telling. But I'll tell you what, I'm running out of steam here, and I sense that you're all anxious to go. I hear that rustling, that telltale rustling. So I will see you on Thursday, and please bring the novel and bring questions and perceptions. Thank you.